Hi everyone, Vinda Ruby here. This is our inaugural episode of the LinkedIn series. We're going to be talking about changes to various countries' immigration policies as a result of COVID-19. I'm really happy today to have Melissa talking with me about Canada. And Canada holds a very special place in my heart for a couple of reasons. One, I lived and worked in Canada for several years. My son was also born there. But this episode's uniquely special because I also have Melissa with us. And Melissa and I worked together for several years as well. So great to have you with us, Melissa. We're going to be going through a lot of information, a lot of updates. Melissa's going to be sharing some great tips with everyone as well. One of the things I do want to talk about is what's going on the front line right now. But first, I'll pass it over to you to introduce yourself and we can get started.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Great to be back via technology across the ocean, but back together nonetheless. So I'm Melissa Babble. I'm the founder and principal lawyer of Babble Immigration Law and a certified specialist in immigration, practicing in Ontario. So what's going on? You know, it's similar to across the world. Lots of restrictions on being together. There's physical distancing requirements. It's maybe a little bit different in Canada in the sense that we have a provincial government level that has mandates over education and health, and as well as the federal level who's putting out instructions for the whole country. And additionally, we have municipal governments who are issuing bylaws for things related to store openings, related to essential businesses, related to use of the parks and common areas and stuff like that. So it is a bit of
tell me that the LCBO is still open. Surely
most importantly, yes, the LCBO is still open, yes, which is the Ontario Liquor Control Board, yes, where you can still get your wine and beer. They're considered an essential service. And actually we just had a secondary list of essential services put out by our Ontario Premier this week. So what was previously allowed to be done in terms of business changed Saturday night at midnight. And so it's a more restrictive list, yeah. I mean, the goal is obviously a common goal, right, to flatten the curve. And so it's important. Lawyers are still on the list, so we're operating more or less as usual, although most of us are working remotely and using technology to support clients.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
so I thought I'd talk about three things, because there's so much information out there, but just the top issues for me right now are logistics around travel, managing in Canada employees, in Canada foreign worker employees, and then in compliance. So those are sort of the three, I'd say, hot button issues among a wide range of hot button issues, but those are the things I'd like to talk about today.
Perfect.
All right, so first on logistics. So, and partially I think because we've been moving very, very quickly, changes to rules and regulations about who can enter Canada have also been changing really quickly. So there was sort of a very quick change and restriction.
Just to jump into that, does Canada have a travel ban list like the US, where if you've been to certain listed countries, you cannot enter into Canada for a period of time, or you're barred unless you fall into one of certain exceptions, being either a US citizen, family members, etc.?
I would say that would be probably the first iteration of the travel restrictions. The most recent iteration, which there's finally now been a cohesive document put together on IRCC's website saying who can and can't enter, and that's essentially that you cannot enter Canada from abroad unless you fit these exceptions. That the exceptions are not related to where you've been, except with the exception of the US, but generally if you've been outside the country. And the exceptions really are, have you been in the US for 14 days exclusively? That's part of the exception. And also, what is your purpose for entering Canada? So the global rule is you can enter Canada for essential purposes. And essential has a variety of definitions, but basically what it means is tourism and cultural activities. So anything, fun or anything, that's sort of non-essential is not permitted. So even if you're coming, for tourism reasons, and you've been in the US, you're likely not to be able to enter unless you fit into one of the other exceptions, which includes immediate family members. So originally, there was, on March 18th, there was effectively a no entry situation, and it was at that point impossible for foreign workers who had work permits or study permits to enter the country. That's been clarified since, and anybody who has an existing work permit or an existing study permit can enter. People who have been approved for work permits also potentially can enter. And so it's really a matter of qualifying yourself. So, I mean, we're talking about a very stressful situation where airlines have cut down on their, their flight availability significantly. You can only fly into 4 major airports in Canada. Not all of the airports are open to international travel. So it's a very restrictive travel environment. And then you have airline staff, frontline airline staff, who are making determinations about who can board planes. And then you have border services officers making determinations about who can enter countries. So there's a lot of there's a heightened concern around international travel.
I think that's an important point. I mean, there's always discretion upon entry into any country, but I guess now that is a much higher level. So even if you have an appropriate visa, if there's reason for an officer to believe that you shouldn't be admitted into Canada, they can still turn you away upon.
Right. Right. And it's a long list, right? So it's first, are you coming in for a legitimate purpose, right? Legitimate, essential, however you want to say it. Why are you coming to Canada? And then do you meet these requirements? And so you've got to fit yourself into an exception. And so the exceptions are like, this is a long list, right? So I would say the best tip from an HR perspective would be to really have your employees who are traveling understand whether or not they squarely fit within these requirements, right? So are they, do they have an existing work permit? Is that work permit valid? Is their passport valid? Are they able to get on an airplane? Do they have any symptoms of illness, right? Because you do have to also, even once, if you satisfy the purpose and your visa requirements, you still have to prove that you're not unwell or bringing the disease into the country. So it's a really, it's like layers of requirements. And I would say the big tip is to have an educated foreign worker population to understand what these requirements are. And they have been changing like very quickly, but there's a clear, maybe we'll put the link in the comments afterwards, but there's a clear set of instructions now that people can follow and understand where they fit, right? So are they exempt? Meaning, are they permitted to enter? Because the general rules are not permitted to enter. And then have that well documented, right? There's a series of, there's been lots of layoffs in Canada, and someone who's on a work permit doesn't necessarily have a job to come to. So from an entry or preparation for entry perspective, you'd really want to have your foreign workers more documented than you normally would, right? So normally the passport and the work permit's enough. These days, I would say you probably want to also have a current job letter confirming that person still has a job, and an isolation plan. Yeah. So, that they are not one of the layoffs, right? And also an isolation plan, right? Because everybody entering Canada is required to isolate for 14 days. And we originally had permissive language around that, and it's now mandatory. So there's this mandatory self-isolation for 14 days, regardless of status, so even Canadian citizens. So having your employees have a plan that says, yes, I have a job, and my job will still be there even though I have to self-isolate, and here's how I'm going to self-isolate. And having that nice, clean documentation for those border service officers, I think, will help smooth the way for entry.
Okay, fantastic. Now, also just to touch on individuals being able to come into Canada, if you're looking to enter into Canada, are you still able to obtain a work permit, get your visas?
So immigration is still processing applications, right? So you can file an application. You can file a work permit application if you're visa requiring in a consulate abroad. And if, in those circumstances, the application does get moved forward. The challenge, though, is if you come from a country that requires medicals. Getting a medical right now is challenging, even harder than challenging, let's say, and providing biometrics, so fingerprints and scans, is not necessarily available, right? So even though you can file the application, completing or finalizing the application is going to be a challenge until we see a little bit of an opening on the logistical side of things. But yes, you can file an application.